Hello and welcome back to Politically Incorrect. I'm Tom Christiano. Well, tonight I'm very pleased that we have a wonderful candidate on our show for the entire hour. He's running for governor of Massachusetts, and his name is Evan Falchuk. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
By the way, is it okay to call you Evan?
Absolutely.
I didn't mean to just
no,
presume
please
on that.
do. Please do.
So you decided to run for governor. When did you actually decide, Evan?
Well, I announced I was running back in February of last year, but this dates back to really, for me, over the last couple of years and seeing how disconnected our political process has become, not just here in Massachusetts, but around the country. And the priorities that our elected leaders, and especially the Democratic and Republican parties, are pursuing don't match up with what most voters want to see. And as an entrepreneur myself, as a person who says you don't want to stand on the sidelines, do something about problems that you see, I said that what we got to do is create a new independent party to represent most voters, which is 53% of voters are now independent in Massachusetts, and to run for governor to bring that kind of leadership that's not tied to the parties and the machines and the interests that fuel those parties.
Yes, and we'll talk about many issues and topics during the show, but the basic philosophy of your independent candidacy, as I understand it, is kind of a fiscally conservative to some extent and socially moderate.
What I describe what I'm doing as a candidate and with the United Independent Party is to say you can be both pragmatically progressive and fiscally sensible at the same time. So you can believe that everybody is equal, everybody's civil rights need to be protected, and that the government should spend its money wisely. And it's not represented in our politics today, and that's what I'm creating.
Wonderful. Well, I'm an independent as well. Because I have Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, everybody on my show, and independents. So I like to be independent because I like to vote the candidate rather than the person. Do you like to do that as well?
I like to vote.
Voting,
you vote for the person, right?
And
you want to look for, this is what I've always been, you want to vote for someone who you think stands for things that they're going to articulate in a genuine and real way. What do they really think? And the trouble that most voters have, and I've been now in more than 70 cities and towns around the state, meeting with thousands of voters in all kinds of different settings, and you hear people say, a lot of the times I feel like with the party candidates, they're there because they've said the things that they're supposed to say, right? They're saying the things that the parties stand for or represent from the special interests that are supporting them versus what do you really think about this issue? And they miss that. And so that's why people say things like, I don't like to vote for the lesser of two evils. I wish I could vote for someone who is just a real person, a genuine individual that had the same kinds of complicated views about the world that are what most voters share. And what's become so polarizing about our politics is that, again, 53% of voters in Massachusetts are now not enrolled in the Democratic or Republican Party. It's the majority. And we've got the largest percentage in the country here in Massachusetts. But it's not just those people. It's when you look at the smaller numbers of people that are voting now, less than ever. This special election for the U.S. Congress that just happened in December, only 13% of people voted for a seat in the United States Congress. 27% in the Senate election, 27% voted. So we're seeing the signs of chipping away at the foundations of what it means to have a good functioning democracy, and it's because the candidates of the parties don't represent what voters are looking for.
Yes. A lot of times when people get a nomination, though, to be a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate, they have a party apparatus behind them. It makes it so much easier for them to run. There's plenty of sign holders and things like that. How are you going to structure your campaign, Evan, in terms of sign holding and all that political apparatus? How are you going to do that?
For the last year, and as an entrepreneur, you start and you just got to do the hard work. There's no getting around that fact. But we've built a team. I've got a dozen staff. We've got hundreds of volunteers all around the state. People go to our website, falchuk2014.org, and they volunteer. They want to get involved because it really is something that is larger than a candidate in an election. It's a statement about what most voters want to see. And when people read about it and they hear about it, they say, how do I get involved? Because I want to be able to talk to my friends and neighbors and colleagues and tell them, look, we don't have to do it the way we've always done it. And so that support has been pretty remarkable. People have been extremely generous with their time in supporting the campaign, and certainly when you get out there to meet people with their insights. and sharing the idea that this is what I'm looking for. This is what we want to see part of the reality.
Yes.
So the parties, of course, have those. When people talk about machines, it's a real thing. I mean, it's a real thing that there are these organized groups, and it's part of the democratic process that they have those available. But it's America, and in America, when you see a problem, you can be creative and entrepreneurial about it and create something new.
Yes.
And that's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Have you ever been involved in politics before?
I've not. My background is in business. I spent the last 13 years as a senior executive. I was president during most of the time of a healthcare company called Best Doctors that we grew.
Doctors.
Yep, we grew from 9 employees up to over 600 over the course of the 13 years that I was there.
Wow.
And it's an employee benefit that helps people make sure they're getting the right diagnosis when they're facing an illness, which is a big problem in our healthcare system.
Really?
And I was a lawyer for 5 years before that. But in building a business and being part of a team, you understand how important it is to be able to articulate a vision of what you want to do, and to rally people, to get them involved and have them want to be part of making that vision a reality, and to be accountable for the results.
Yes.
And I think what most voters see is that those traits of vision and accountability and consensus, they just don't exist in government today. It's not part of the DNA of how the political process works. It's not the kind of leaders that we're producing. We have to stop that. We have to create a new way of doing things, and that's why I'm running.
Wonderful. And were you the CEO, did you say?
No, I was the president. I was the president.
The president. So, but you had a lot of authority and power as a president, obviously, right?
Well, in any company, the question of authority and power is always, it only goes as far as your ability to articulate that vision and to make sure that everybody is able to say, yes, I want to be a part of that, right? Poor managers manage through fear and intimidation and things like that. The really good ones are great at articulating, what are we trying to accomplish and how do we get there? And I like to think that was a lot of the way that I managed and the way I run this campaign. You have to be engaging with people. So yeah, there was a lot of responsibility associated with having the roles that I had in the company. And I'll tell you something else. Small businesses, we were 9 people. We got to be reasonably sized. We're up to 600 people. It's a pretty big business. They think in a very different way from the way we see government think. They're dynamic. They're not bureaucratic. They sort of almost laugh at competitors that are being bureaucratic and slow. And they don't like to be stuck with problems. They figure out how to solve them and they move forward and they do it. Right? That's what it's about to be an entrepreneur and be a business person. We don't see that in the way that government operates. We certainly don't see it in the political process. So the opportunity to bring that kind of an energy and drive to our politics is a lot of what we need to see. And that's what I'm bringing, through my own work and through creating United Independent. It means there'll be other candidates that we can vote for to put in our legislature that will have that same approach.
Are you creating a party? Did you say United Independent?
Yeah.
Is that a new independent party here in Massachusetts?
It is right now under the law, it's a political designation. One of the many structural barriers to independent candidates in Massachusetts, one of them, by the way, is our campaign finance laws. Under Massachusetts law, if you're a party, Democratic or Republican, and a candidate of one of those parties, you're allowed to raise $15,000 per person per year through a complicated set of federal accounts, state accounts, et cetera. As an independent, I'm only allowed to raise $1,000 per person per year. All right. Now,
it doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, how could they do that?
The way it's the right question, and the answer is they made the rules. And so, not surprisingly, they seem to exclude any competition. And it's why, when you think about the fact that 53% of voters are independent, why do we not have a single legislator who's independent? It's because of these kinds of barriers.
Yeah, that is terrible.
So the way you break through this, and this is the vision behind what we're doing here, is create a new party, a new platform to do this. Under the law, once a candidate gets 3% of the vote in a statewide election, that organization that he's running with becomes an official party, and then that makes easier access to the ballot and all the other things that we've talked about. We're going to do a lot better than that. Clearly, we'll be an official party after 2014, and as we look forward to 2016, the opportunity to really change our political process is real. The one thing I just want to add to that is that these campaign finance laws must be changed. They ought to apply across the board to everybody, and we have to reduce the number of dollars that are coming into the system. It's a corrupting influence that pulls us away from the things that we need to focus on.
Throughout the country, I think we have that problem, and I don't know if it's ever going to change, though. We've heard about it for many, many years, campaign finance reform. We had some version of it nationally 10 or 15 years ago. Remember McCain-Feingold and all that? And it just, just never seems to go anywhere
It's-
long term.
yeah.
And the lobbyists, there's so many lobbyists in Washington now, right? That they have so much influence over the legislative process.
Right.
That it's one reason I think Congress's approval rating is down to 10 or 11%.
Right.
Because people could see through that and how they aren't really looking out for the people as much as the special interests.
It's true, and I think this challenge about how do you go about changing those campaign finance laws, again, the parties benefit from the laws as they currently exist.
Yes.
So when you hear a lot of talk about, boy, I wish there were a way that we could do something about it, but it's hard, I say, well, hold on a second. You, Democrats and Republicans, passed laws that make it so that an independent like me is only allowed to raise $1,000 per person per year.
Yes.
So if you are able to do that together, I might add, why can't you apply those same rules to yourselves?
Yes.
Right? So they are not powerless to do something about these issues. They just
Yes.
don't want to.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know whether a conclusion you can draw. So if most voters start to recognize this is how really important social change happens.
Yes.
When a majority of voters realize that they're actually in the majority and that they're not comfortable with the same old approach to our politics, and they elect candidates who want to take a different approach to this, we will see the kind of change that we're looking for.
Which would be very wonderful. I think they have changed so that campaign finance is equal for everyone, so that independents have as much chance to win an election as a Democrat or Republican. So the rules aren't stacked against them, the independent candidates. So hopefully your candidacy will help in all of that, Evan. And could you tell us a little bit more about your background, if you want, about your education, family, like work history and all that? Whatever you want to tell us about yourself.
I grew up in Newton, Mass., which is where I live now with my wife and our 3 kids.
3 children?
Yep, they're 13, 10, and 6.
All going to school in Newton?
They are, yep,
Okay,
right.
good.
One of them is in the middle school up the street from our house, and the other 2 are in the elementary school nearby as well. So they're in the
Nice.
Newton Public Schools, which are great. And my wife is now getting her master's actually in social work at Boston College.
Oh, nice.
And she's started to work with her placement now, so I'm just very proud of the work that she's doing, and I find it very inspirational.
Wow,
What
yes,
she's taken on, and
Yes.
my career started in law. As I said, I went to college in Pennsylvania at Lehigh University, law school at
Yes,
University of
yeah.
Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
and moved back here to Massachusetts in 1999. Where I've been,
1999,
where I've been ever since. And,
So you got your law degree from Lehigh? About
law degree at University of Pennsylvania, which
University of Pennsylvania, I'm sorry.
94.
Oh, and what about Lehigh?
Lehigh graduated in 91. That was my college.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
undergraduate,
your undergraduate. Yeah.
Yep.
So 1999, you moved back here
I did.
after you had your law degree.
Yeah.
And then what did you do?
Well, that's when I started to work at Best Doctors, and it's a global business. My father's side of the family comes from Venezuela, and a lot of our business is in Latin America, and I speak Spanish, which has been an
nice.
important part of as I've campaigned around the state and certainly gone into communities of people with a Latin background. It's fantastic to be able to connect with people in Spanish and to be able to do
Yes.
that kind of work. And it's an important part of what I think any candidate has to do. It's great if you speak another language. I think it's a wonderful skill to have for anybody.
Yes.
But also it is reflective of how important it is to connect with people, just to go out and talk to anybody and everybody and listen to what they have to say.
Yeah. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
So you started with Best
Yeah,
Doctors?
started with Best Doctors in '99. I was a lawyer at a
99.
large firm in D.C. during the 1990s. And
You were right in Washington, D.C.?
right in Washington, D.C., yeah, in the nation's
Were you
capital.
involved in national politics at that time?
No, we were doing internal investigations and things of that nature, sort of litigation. And when I joined Best Doctors in '99, small company, great concept of helping people make sure they navigate through the healthcare system with the right diagnosis. And it grew. We grew as a team. We really grew that business to where it is now. And I left there at the end of June because of this year, of 2013, because I was pursuing this race full time.
full
And
time.
it's a 7-day-a-week job,
Wow,
and you
it's
have to be out
amazing.
there meeting voters anywhere and everywhere.
Yes.
And it's
you have 12 people working with your campaign or something?
I do, yeah.
Wonderful. So you did
Hundreds
that
and hundreds of volunteers all around the state.
Yeah,
And the volunteers are the lifeblood and the backbone of any
yes,
campaign. So
yes.
we've got our headquarters in Boston where the staff spends their time, but we're out all around the state all the time.
Are you going to have any smaller headquarters elsewhere in the state?
We will.
Because it's a bit wide state. You have Springfield, then you go way out to the Berkshires, and It's just a very big state in
It
many
is,
ways.
although I'll tell you, I've been to so many communities across the state, and I was in North Adams not so long ago, and I was meeting with some people there, and a voter told me that, boy, it's great that someone from the eastern part of the state comes out here to see us.
Yeah.
And my thought was, I shouldn't get extra points for this because I'm running for governor.
Yes, yeah.
And the other thing is that it's 2 hours.
Yeah.
And my job at Best Doctors used to travel all around the world. So the idea of driving 2 hours to some part of the state should not be something
Yes.
that's an extra thing to do. And it really reflects something that I hear all over the place, which is voters saying, people don't listen to us.
Yeah.
I hear out in the Berkshires, I've heard it out in the Pioneer Valley, I've heard it in Central Mass, I've heard it up here in places like Lowell, down the South Coast, even in the Metro West area. And there's a point when you hear that, you say, it isn't you, the voter, that doesn't think you're being paid attention to, it's actually they're not paying attention to you.
Yes, yeah.
It's a real feeling that's out there. And again, when we talk about the things that corrode and undermine the vitality of the democratic process, it's this. It's in a business world, you'd say it's really bad customer service.
Yes.
And that's what's happening in politics.
It's amazing. So about 7 days a week you're working at this?
Yeah.
So it must be very tough on you and your family, isn't it, to do that? I mean, I just admire your stamina and your ability to do this. You're putting a lot of your own personal funds into the campaign. It's an awful big commitment for a very young man, too. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm 44,
44,
so
yeah.
I'm
Not too,
over,
it's
I'm at
good
a
age for governor,
and,
I think President Kennedy was elected at like 43 or something, President of the United States.
Right.
So
yeah,
44
and
is
look,
a good age.
if you really
politics.
believe in something, which is the way I feel about this, and I really think it's important that we have a really vibrant democratic process that represents what voters are looking for. It's the reason people have this great feeling and promise about America. That's why people wanted to come here.
Yes.
My grandfather, my father's father, emigrated from Russia, not to the United States because he couldn't get in, but to Cuba, and ended up in Venezuela, where he spent all of his life until he was 101 when he died.
Wow.
But he always wanted to make sure that his sons would end up in America, okay? Because this was where he knew that they would have the opportunity to be treated equally and fairly, and where they could have an opportunity for their kids to get ahead and to do well. And that's why people come here. And when we see things happening like we see today, where the political process has become disconnected, voters aren't participating, 63% of the races in the state legislature don't have any opposition in them, that's the things that are the symptoms of the problem that starts to say, okay, if we mess this up here in America, where are we all supposed to emigrate to?
Right.
So this isn't hey, it would be nice if we could fix these problems. We have to. This is our responsibility.
We certainly could try, yes. I certainly hope we do. Well, how about if we talk about some of the issues in the campaign?
Absolutely.
Since we talked about your background, is there anything else you want to say about the background?
Let's talk about
some issues.
Tom.
Great,
I love
great.
issues.
Well, how about the $34 billion fiscal year 2014 state budget is going to go up by about $1.5 billion. Well, what do you think about the state budget, basically, this year? Whatever the figures are, the exact figures.
Look, one of the things that I hear about really all across the state is people thinking that the money that the state spends is not spent in a accountable or transparent way.
Yeah.
Right? That most voters don't believe that that is the money that is needed to do all the things that the state wants to do. Yeah. Now, this is the interesting thing about the political process. You will hear people say, so what we should do is cut and slash government. Okay, and that's not what most voters are saying. They're just saying, I want government to do a lot of things. We need it to do many, many important things. I just want it to do it in a way that is at least as efficient as we might expect to see any other parts of the world.
Yes.
And government doesn't do that very well. So most voters, when they hear that number, they say, you know what, I bet you 5, 10, 15% of that money is unnecessary spending. Money that you'd say, we wouldn't miss it if it wasn't spent. Let's be generous about it and say it was just 3%. For a $34 billion budget, we're talking about $1 billion a year.
Yes.
And now it becomes a question of what programs are not being funded that could be funded, whether it's programs for education, computers in schools, job training programs. In Western Massachusetts, they still struggle with making sure that there's broadband internet access, transportation projects that we struggle to fund, all manner of things that we hear, oh, there's no money for. But there would be if someone could take a hard look at how we're spending our money and removing programs and people and structures that don't fit with what we need the government to be doing.
Yes.
So it takes a level of just responsibility and accountability around these things.
Yes.
When we went through this issue earlier last year around the tech tax, right, which was a tax that was placed on certain internet services tied to the transportation bill, and it was ultimately repealed. It wasn't a very good idea.
Right.
The issue was, geez, where are we going to find the $100 million, which is about a very tiny percentage of the state's $34 billion budget.
Yes.
And my view on that was, you're not trying hard enough if in $34 billion you can't find $100 million. Most voters, most businesses, if you told them, listen, you're going to have to get by with 0.1% less money than what you had last year, you figure out how to do it.
Yes.
For some reason in politics, it's, boy, how do I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
We need a level of creativity and diligence and effort that we don't see very much right now.
Yes. Have you gone through the budget, at least in a cursory manner, the entire state budget to look at where all the money goes?
It's fascinating when you start to look at.
We've
We've done a lot of that work, and it's actually quite fascinating because you can see at a very high level a lot of the spending. So there's been a large amount of new disclosures that have happened over the last few years where you can start to see some things. The trouble is, it's data without context or the ability to understand what it means in many cases. So the state has done a lot of really good work at disclosing big tax breaks, for example. And big tax breaks are an area where you'd say, boy, if these tax breaks are not delivering value to the state, we ought not to be doing those things.
Yes.
On the spending side, it's a lot harder to see how the state's money is being spent. But you can see all the symptoms of it. I mean, there are small things like the $15 million that was spent over the last 2 years on new office furniture in state buildings.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that state workers don't need good furniture, but that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money. And it reflects a spending philosophy that is not in line with the way that most voters are seeing things.
Yeah, thank you. Well, another topic we might want to talk about, the state income tax rate. What do you think about the current state income tax rate? I think it's recently gone down to 5.2%.
It did. And there was a law that was passed several years ago that said if collections were up to a certain level, that it would automatically drop down to 5.2 from 5.25%. So we've just had a tax cut. So
yeah. So we are at
congratulations.
5.2 now. What do you think of that? Because I remember a few years ago, the state, most of the people voted to get us down to 5%. Remember that?
Yeah, so we have, one of the interesting things about Massachusetts is that we've got a flat tax system. We're one of only 7 states in the country with a flat tax.
There's only 7 of us.
Yeah, most voters don't realize that we actually have a flat tax, which you would tend to think of as a very Republican idea, perhaps.
Yeah.
And while there's a lot of exemptions and deductions that have been built in to try to make that tax system more progressive, the reality is a flat tax is a regressive tax. People with less disposable income end up paying a higher percentage of that than people with more disposable income. And it's the same thing for business taxes, and for each class has to be flat. So we have an issue with this in Massachusetts.
Yes.
Now, when it comes to overall tax burden, interestingly enough, Massachusetts ranks 43rd in the country as far as how high our taxes is, state and local taxes. So we actually are not a particularly high tax state.
We're 43rd,
43rd in the country.
So we have 42 states that tax at a higher rate than we do, or
That's
tax more than we do.
An overall tax burden.
It's overall,
Right.
yeah.
Now, we do have some taxes that are higher perhaps than other states, where you look at things like corporate taxes, which are higher here.
Yeah.
I believe that things like capital gains taxes, which are treated like regular income here in Massachusetts, which is different from federal law, it would be good to treat those things differently, because that's all about entrepreneurship and how do you make sure people are rewarded for long-term investments and creating things, or even in just saving for their retirement.
Yes.
But what we ought to be doing is, this is one of the challenges that we have. There is an interesting tax commission that has been created in the legislature now to try to look at what would a modern tax code look like in Massachusetts. We could build it from scratch.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of work that should be done, that I want to do as governor, is to say, what should a tax code look like that's good for the 21st century? Because we're working off of a tax code right now that was built basically at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. So it's time to stop with all the little pieces that have been put together over the last 100 years and say, what would it look like if we could build a sensible, practical, pragmatic tax structure that helped build businesses, helped families save, and was fair?
Yes.
And that's really what we should be aspiring for.
And there's a committee at the State House
There's a
working
committee in the
on that
legislature
now?
that was working on putting together some reporting on that. So I'm very interested to see how that looks.
Yes.
But I think that the larger point is that this is something that should be done over a period of years to make sure we build consensus and we have the right people looking at it to say this is the way this should work.
Yes.
And that's what I want to do.
Wonderful. Wonderful. By the way, you think you'd work very well with the legislature? Because you would need to do that as governor. The Republicans, Democrats, you think you can get along well with them and get them to pass some bills that you would like to see passed?
Of course. And I think that part of the problem with this is that if we think about the world as just, you got Democrats and you got Republicans, and then it's always a question of who's up and who's down. And I don't want to pass legislation that your side wants because that's going to be necessarily bad for my side. And it becomes now a question of, are we doing the people's business or are we serving our own party's agendas? And that's where we get stuck.
Yes.
So I think as a leader, independent of what it is that you're doing, you have an obligation to engage with people and to build consensus with them and to say, where do we have shared beliefs and where can we find common ground, and let's move forward with the people's business.
Yes.
We used to see this a lot in our government, in the 1980s, as recently as the 1980s, when Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House and Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States. The two of them get in a room together, and they came from very different points of view, but you knew when they left that maybe both guys would be a little bit unhappy with what they agreed to, but they both know that they did the right thing.
Yes.
We need to see more of that kind of leadership. And it's there. There are people out there who want to do that way, and some of them are in the legislature. So I will be able to work with those people in that way, which is a question of what kind of style of manager, of leader, of person are you?
Yes.
And truthfully, it's why I think that as voters listen to candidates talk during the election process, they should think of it as a long interview process where you get to hear what that person is like, because you're going to be stuck with that person.
Yes.
And that's what it's about.
What is it, 2 years, the term for governor?
It's a 4-year term.
Oh, it's a 4-year, I'm sorry, I should know. It's
4
2 years for our legislators,
Absolutely.
right?
Correct.
Wow. Well, another topic, how about business incentives to move and build companies here in Massachusetts? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Massachusetts is one of the most expensive states in the country to live in and to do business in. It's the greater Boston area is the third most expensive metropolitan area in the country. Wow. It's remarkable when you think about that. When you start to dig under it, say, okay, well, what's that coming from? Two big drivers, housing costs and healthcare costs. Okay, that's what's been growing over the last number of years, and healthcare costs are up something like 170% since 2005 here in Massachusetts.
Really?
So it's becoming a really significant problem. Now, if I'm starting a business or hiring employees in Massachusetts, all of that stuff means that I have to pay more to hire an employee in Massachusetts than if I were to hire that person in, say, Raleigh, North Carolina, or Denver, Colorado, or even a place like Chicago or San Francisco. And so we are very much
San Francisco is very expensive.
It is, but cheaper than the Boston area. Amazingly,
Really?
So when you say, okay, well, we are in competition with these places, and we want to do things that help businesses grow, we have to get at the root causes, the real drivers of these problems. So let's talk about healthcare, because my background is from that. It's one of the most important areas. There is extensive data on how consolidated our healthcare markets are. On the insurance side, 3 companies have 79% of the health insurance market. On the hospital side, a small number of hospital systems that are consolidating have about 72% of the market. And the data shows that when hospitals consolidate, they increase prices, and that those increased prices are not tied to improvements in quality or improvements in efficiency, and it all flows back through those insurance companies and comes out of the pockets of consumers and small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and then at the end of the day, the large businesses as well. Tackling that issue is really one of the things that state government is supposed to be about. You are not supposed to engage in anti-competitive practices. You're not supposed to be engaged in pricing practices that hurt consumers. And yet, it happens under the watchful eye of our state government. So my plan and belief is that we must stop those mergers and consolidations from happening on the hospital side. And I believe it's necessary to create a new fee structure that's equitable across the board among the different hospitals, so we don't see these differential kinds of pricing that, again, hurt consumers, hurt businesses, and make it more difficult for businesses to grow and for individuals to save and to get ahead. We have to attack that issue. We have to tackle it, or else we will not continue to have the prosperity that we've had in this state.
Well, what do you think about the healthcare system that Massachusetts instituted under Governor Romney a few years ago and was an example for the entire country with Obamacare recently? What do you think about that? Because you were in the medical field.
Yeah, it's worked from the standpoint of making sure that everybody was covered. And that was the goal that was set out at the beginning. Let's make sure everybody's covered. And so they decided to go with a kind of private sector solution. Buy insurance from health insurance companies. If you can't afford it, we'll subsidize you. We're going to change some things to make insurance more reliable and not exclude people with pre-existing conditions. That was the basic framework. And so people are covered. We've got almost universal coverage at this point in Massachusetts. It has solved the coverage issue, but it has not solved the cost issue. And the reason it does not solve the cost issue is that it is not grappling with the underlying cause of the increased costs, which are these consolidations of the hospitals and the pricing power that they're bringing to the table. So we have to go after that. We have to make that stop and go in a different direction to really get the kind of change that we're looking for.
In fact, in the legislature, did I read that some of the legislators will be bringing up an idea of any hospital that gets public funds, we're going to limit the amount that the CEOs, and I imagine other officers, can get there, because some of them are making like millions of dollars and yet getting like $8 million a year to be a CEO of a company here in Massachusetts and yet get state funding. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I haven't seen that legislation, though I've heard moves like that that people are looking at for a lot of different industries. It gets at a symptom, but it doesn't get at the underlying problem. So the hospitals are not running themselves as enormously efficient business enterprises, and it's because they don't have to. They don't have to. They can charge what they want to charge, and they pass along the cost to consumers through the insurance premium that consumers then have to pay. And the reality of it is that's been going on for many, many years. There is so much data on this. In fact, even the Attorney General has been reporting on it since at least 2010 about how this kind of structure has been in place, but nothing actually happens. So when the hospitals if the hospitals were here, they would say, well, we can't afford to make care cheaper. We're under so much pressure for price. The insurance companies are always banging on us to make it cheaper. It's not a genuine reflection of what's actually happening. And you're right, when you see very high compensation by senior executives in companies, it's oftentimes a reflection of something that's going on that is wasteful. Now, I'm not against people making a lot of money. I think it's an honorable thing to build a business and to become successful and to get paid and to get the rewards of it. I think it's something else when you're taking public money, or more importantly, providing a very much needed public service that is causing other problems because people can't afford it. That should be allowed to go on.
I feel the same way. If we're giving a lot of public money to a hospital, and they're paying their CEO $8 million, and the President of the United States gets paid $400,000, is there a good reason for that person, the CEO, to get 20 times as much as the President of the United States? I would venture to say no, that he shouldn't get maybe just twice what the President gets at the most. Maybe give him $800,000. But $8 million is ridiculous,
it becomes like,
and it all goes into our health insurance premiums, and then less people could afford it, and it's just
it's part of the larger theme of the things that are going on today with the amount of, yes, there's income inequality. I think that's a very, very important part of what's happening in our country and even here in Massachusetts. But also, very interestingly, median incomes, just the typical person's income in Massachusetts over the last decade have stayed stagnant. While the cost of living has gone up.
In terms of real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars.
Inflation-adjusted dollars. They've stayed basically stagnant while the real cost of everything else has gone up. When we talk about housing, we talk about healthcare, we talk about everything else, energy. So it makes it much harder for the ordinary person to get ahead when it's hard for them to save, because they have to keep spending the money that they have just for the basics of life. There was a study that just came out that was talking about the fact that 50% of renters in Massachusetts are spending more than a third of their income on housing. And it's true for homeowners. About 40% of homeowners are spending about a third of their income for the housing and the utilities and property taxes. That's a real problem. And the wake-up call that business leaders also need to have is, look, your employees at a certain point aren't going to be able to afford to work for you. And at that point, you will have to move those jobs either somewhere else, or we're going to have something else is going to have to give here in Massachusetts. So we have an obligation to actually do something about these things. Part of the reason that I talk about these issues and why I'm so passionate about them is that we really do have this obligation to be practical and pragmatic and to just look square in the eye at the challenges that we face and to talk openly about them.
Yes.
And say, look, this is what the data tells us. What are we supposed to do?
Yes.
We have to do something. We can't say, you know what we want to do as Americans, we're going to just pretend that these problems don't exist.
Yes.
That isn't what it's supposed to be about.
Yeah.
It's not what it's supposed to be
So
about.
what would you recommend in terms of the medical system specifically? Any ideas?
If you can stop those consolidations of the hospitals,
Okay, yeah, that's what-
and if you have a uniform pricing structure, one of the things that happens
For the
today is that
services,
hospitals
yeah.
charge all kinds of differential rates.
Even in
and
Massachusetts?
Even in
Yeah,
Massachusetts,
okay,
depending
yeah.
on who the insurance company is, depending on who you're covered by. And they charge really outrageous pricing for many of these procedures.
I know,
And there
yes.
isn't a level of accountability or transparency around these things.
Yes,
So
right.
we've seen in other states, places like Maryland, for example, that have created a payer system, an all-payer system, where they say, look, this is what the price is. And there's profit built in for you, hospital. You got to be able to make money because the quality of care depends on your ability to be delivering these kinds of services. But there should be a rationality to this so that people
Yes.
aren't paying, $3,800 to have an X-ray or something like these
yes,
things that you see
exactly.
all the time on the internet.
Yes.
If you can get rid of, and there are studies that say 25, 30, 40% of spending in healthcare is wasted. But let's say it was only 5%. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars a year, hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of an administration. That's money going right back into the pockets of consumers and small businesses. That's more than you could do with any kind of tax cut without hurting any business or individual or the quality of care that's delivered.
Yes.
And we have to be able to look that in the eye and say we have to solve this issue.
Yes, wonderful. Well, how about another big issue here in Massachusetts, which is casino gambling? I know a lot has been going on with it lately, and what are your thoughts about that? I'm sure you've been reading all about it. You're up in the latest news.
Yeah, absolutely. So gambling, I don't have a problem with people going to casinos. It can be an enjoyable pastime, and sometimes it's not so healthy to go there and do it, but it's a fact of life in America. They passed a law saying that we can have casinos in Massachusetts if the city or town approves it.
Yeah.
Put it to vote with peoples in cities and towns, and most of them said we don't want it.
Right. Yeah, so far.
So we may have one casino. Maybe there's going to be one on one of the tribal lands down in Taunton.
Yeah.
Look, it is not a recipe for how you do economic development.
Okay. Yeah.
They do bring some amount of jobs. Of course, there's entertainment value associated with it. It's a business.
Yes.
But I think that we'd be better off as a state if we spent as much time and effort trying to do things that would help small and medium-sized businesses grow as we did trying to make sure that we lured casinos into Massachusetts.
Yes.
I think we'd be much better served if we spent all the time and resources and political capital on trying to address this issue of healthcare costs and housing costs than we would by trying to bring one or two casinos into Massachusetts.
Yes.
So it's a classic example of a solution that is looking for a problem.
Yeah.
And near as I can tell, the problem that it's trying to solve is a lack of casinos in Massachusetts. But it isn't like there's a groundswell of voters saying, bring this in.
Right.
Once you're presented the option, some cities and towns say, yep, I want it. Others say, no, I don't.
Yeah.
And we move forward.
Yes. There may be a ballot question coming up this year to repeal
Indeed.
the recently passed casino law, as I understand it. And then there's one proposed, I think, for Revere, Mass, Suffolk Downs, too, a big,
Right.
I saw a rendering of something there. So there's still a lot going on with that. But there might only be a few. But one thing I wouldn't like to see is slot machines in every community in Massachusetts, the way we have the lottery now. For example, in the New York Times about a week or two ago, I read in Italy that since they allowed these slot machines in all these little communities, there's a lot of people that have become addicted to gambling, because it's one thing if you go to a casino for it, but it's another thing if it's right in front of you all the time, slot machine, and that noise and whatever. So I hope, no matter what, that we don't do something like that. And you would never envision something like that,
No.
right? Where you
Right.
have slot machines all over in Chelmsford, Westford,
Right. And
Newton.
it's not part of the law that they
Yeah.
passed was
Yeah,
to create
good.
that. So
Yeah.
no.
That's
And again, the real economic development is about helping small and medium-sized businesses. It's not about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I wouldn't mind even helping large businesses too, because they provide a lot of employers as well.
Absolutely.
As long as we treat everybody equally, we allow the small businesses to get started and to prosper and to grow here in Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
I think large businesses are well too. I worked for a large one for quite a few years, and they provide a lot of jobs too and benefits. Well, another law, you mentioned housing earlier, and I'm sure you're very familiar with the 40B housing law. It's very controversial in towns like Chelmsford and Westford and Billerica and throughout the state of Massachusetts. And as you know, sometimes, like there's going to be one proposed in Chelmsford, Mass, 120 units with only about 20% of them so-called affordable units. The others are going to be market rate, but because they're going to call this a 40B development, they're going to build these 120 units on about 4.8 acres of land, whereas normally there would only be 5 houses on there. So it's a way for developers to get these huge developments in, but only 20% of the units need to be affordable. Sometimes 25%, 25%. So what do you think about this 40B law?
We've got a challenge with these zoning laws, no question about it, for a couple of reasons. We've got, on the one hand, the need to make sure that there's affordable housing, which is really important. As I mentioned, this is one of the 2 things that's driving the cost of living in Massachusetts. On the other hand, cities and towns have a right to control what happens within their borders, and 40B essentially overrides that.
Yes, correct.
Keeping in mind that developers are politically powerful people, right?
Yes.
And so there's a
Huge
reason why
lobby
these laws come to pass. Now, a sensible way of dealing with this issue, stepping back from the problem for a moment, would be to say we do need to have a policy around housing that makes more affordable housing available for people that live in our state. More multifamily housing, more communities that are tied to public transportation centers, more communities that allow for people that have jobs that need affordable housing where they've got proximity to ways to get there and resources around them that are suitable for what their needs are. And you know, the legislature did pass 40R, which makes available this concept of these smart zoning areas, where cities and towns could say, listen, what we're deciding is, in this area, we're going to allow for some affordable housing development. It's going to be tied to whatever structures they want, and there'd be state funding to support the community that decided to go ahead and do that. Now, a number of cities and towns have gone and created these smart zones. Unfortunately, when that law was passed, it was around the time of the financial crisis. So a lot of this sort of stopped, and now some development is starting to pick up again. I think we should be doing more to make sure. And by the way, another one, 40V, which was making sure that housing in communities where there were, old mills, for example, where you could convert those things into condominiums and other things, that we could support that effort to make sure that we can redevelop those to make it so that people can move into those places. So I'd like to see us do more to make sure that 40B becomes, for want of a better word, irrelevant, because we're going to be focused more on saying, let's have some smart development about this. Let's do it in an intelligent way. Let's let communities decide, listen, here's areas where you could do this, and if you're going to do it, this is the way it ought to look, and build public consensus around the way this should work is we should be coming together regionally in different parts of the state and saying, this is where we think it makes the most sense to be building these things. The recipe of 40B today is for sprawl. And it just is not. It's not the kind of thoughtful, comprehensive, strategic approach to housing that we're capable of in our state.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. How about, as I'm sure you've been reading about Colorado recently and medical marijuana, and they recently, beginning this last week, allowed recreational marijuana sales, and they have had medical marijuana sales for a while now. Here in Massachusetts, as you know, we recently passed a medical marijuana law, and now local communities, and there's going to be so many per county or whatever, medical marijuana dispensaries here in Massachusetts. So my question to you is, what do you think about all of these medical marijuana laws, and not only medical, but recreational, decriminalization?
I think it's to be clear about it, I think it's very clear that the public would rather see this drug legalized and taxed, and I feel the same way. I think the problem with the medical marijuana part of it is that the medical word is sort of interesting. There's clearly, from studies that you see, there's medical benefits from the use of marijuana, but this isn't the same thing as a drug that you could go and produce and mass produce. I mean, this isn't exactly science the way it's being done. So unfortunately, the experience we've seen in places like California with medical marijuana is that it becomes a little bit of a backdoor version of legalization. So we end up in a world in which the law, everybody knows, and they sort of wink at each other and smile about the fact that the law is really kind of a way to legalize marijuana without doing it.
Yes.
I don't think that's smart politics or policy. I don't think that's healthy for a democracy to have laws that people are just openly flaunting.
Yes.
So I'd much rather say, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. Let's do it in an organized and systematic way. That's what Colorado did.
Yeah.
They said, we're going to regulate this from the point of production to the point of sale, and we're going to tax it.
Yeah.
And they're collecting a lot of new tax revenue from
Yes.
this.
I think it's what, 25%
25%.
on the recreational
Yeah,
use or something?
plus the sales tax on top of that.
Yeah, it's
so
huge.
what they're able to do now is say, let's take something that's happening in a black market way, which is diverting law enforcement resources, it's getting young people into trouble, and it's something that most people want to see legalized anyway, and let's make it legal. And let's
Yes.
now treat it like we do alcohol or tobacco and
Yes.
move forward on that basis.
Yes.
This notion of saying, well, let's keep it illegal, but let's make it legal for certain medical purposes, but let's just let a doctor sign
Which
a
is
piece
what
of
we
paper and
have.
get it.
Well, we have something like that in Massachusetts now. We'll be coming into medical marijuana, right?
I would
Yeah,
much rather we
yeah,
were open
yeah.
and straight up
Yeah.
about it and say, this is the
Yeah.
story. We're not going to pretend that we're not legalizing it by doing the backdoor thing. Legalize it, tax it, make it part of
Yeah,
part of the economy.
yeah. Did you happen to read David Brooks's column in the New York Times last week about marijuana?
I didn't read the
Didn't
column.
read
I
it?
saw it, but I didn't get to read
Oh,
it.
okay, yeah, it's very interesting, and you might want to take a look at that. I thought he made some very good points about it, but it's going to be a very interesting topic, I think, here in Massachusetts and throughout the country. Looks like for decades to come, or whatever. But decriminalization, I think, is something that could easily be done, and we did something like that in Massachusetts, didn't we? Beginning a year or two ago, I think. We decriminalized, at least here in Chelmsford, we did. I think it might be throughout the state, right?
Right.
Do you happen to know?
Yeah,
what
they
went
were
on there?
instead of arresting you for use of it, they could issue you a citation.
A citation. I see,
So
yeah.
so again, it's
So
they
they
this
don't
sort
have a
of
felony kind of record or anything
right,
like that,
but
which is good.
it's again
yeah.
the sort of wink and a nod. It says,
Yeah.
we don't want this to be legal, but we don't actually want to step up and
Yeah.
make it this way.
Yes.
And that's the part that, again, when you think about what voters tell you all the time, or tell me all the time when I'm out there meeting people,
Yes.
they feel as if there's this disconnect. They feel as if people aren't leveling with them. So think about what you tell young people as they grow up and they see that marijuana is very common in their lives and they know it's illegal. So what does that tell them to think about respect for the law?
They lose respect
You lose
for the
respect
law, I
for it.
think,
You lose
yes.
respect for adults who you look to say, hey, what are the rules? What's the difference between right and wrong?
Yes.
And say, well, you know what, marijuana, it's
Yeah.
okay. I know it's illegal, but
Yes,
and it's
right.
people do these things, and it's a part of reality, and we should embrace it and recognize it and move
Yes.
forward.
Do you happen to know if we have anybody in Massachusetts jails because of marijuana laws at the moment? I don't know. I haven't read about that.
I don't have
know.
those statistics.
But it'd be too bad, I think, if it wasn't a big, huge dealer or somebody. You hear those things in some parts of the country, like in Texas sometimes or whatever. Somebody gets thrown in jail for a year or something, and for marijuana possession. It's just kind of crazy.
Right.
At $30,000 or $40,000 a year to put somebody in jail, and then they're surrounded by not very nice people sometimes, and they learn how to be a criminal.
Right.
It just doesn't make any
It doesn't
sense
make
to me.
sense.
So decriminalization. It would be very important, I think, for drug laws. And, when you're not dealing a big amount of drugs, I don't think anybody should be in prison for something like that.
It
And
it becomes a very large social issue because there's a lot of communities in our state where young people become into contact with law enforcement really earlier in their career,
Yeah.
in their
Oh,
in their
yeah,
lives,
lives, yeah.
and it gets in the way of their career development, right? Because
Yes.
now they've entered into a system that is not designed to be a social services agency, which a
Yes.
lot of young people need.
Yes.
And the trouble is that we've become very fixated on treating every problem as a law enforcement problem.
Yes.
Law enforcement does remarkable work in our state in keeping us safe and doing the important work that they do.
Yeah.
Their job is not to help kids make sure they end up on the right path. There are
Yes.
great people that are doing that kind of work. We need to steer those kids into that kind of direction and not into our prisons and jail system. This isn't the way
I
it
think
should
to
work.
throw young people in prison, you have to be really serious about that, and there has to be a very good reason for them to be there.
Indeed.
Because even young or any age of a person, because the environment can be quite toxic.
Yeah.
And it could engender criminal behavior in them for the rest of their lives, and also make it very difficult for them to get good jobs once they get
Right.
out.
Exactly.
And it's a revolving door of heading downward,
Mm-hmm.
I think. So I'm glad we agree that we should try to do whatever we can to see that doesn't happen here in Massachusetts.
Indeed,
If
absolutely.
you win election here, that'd be nice. So how about the Affordable Care Act, we didn't talk specifically about that. We talked about medical care, but any thoughts about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act? It's certainly a huge topic in our country right now.
It is. It's a good example of the way that the political process makes it difficult to talk rationally about subjects, because the Affordable Care Act is at the end of the day a replica of what we have here in Massachusetts. And so as a way to get people covered, this shouldn't be that controversial. Right. But you hear it talked about as government takeover of health care, which it's not. You hear it described in all these very exaggerated, strange ways, which are detached from the reality of what it is. But this is where our political process has taken us today.
Yes, yes.
And that's why, by the way, we need leadership that says we're independent. We're not tied to those interests. We're not going to play those partisan games.
Yes, yes. Well, our time is running shorter. I can't believe it. The time has flown by. It's so great. We still have some time, but it's so great to talk to you. I mean, I think you have studied the issues very thoroughly. You're very obviously intelligent and able to articulate your positions on the issues. So it's just wonderful, Evan. And it's so great to meet you. This is the first time I'm meeting you. And I'm so glad you were able to come here to Chelmsford for our show. And
pleasure.
As everyone knows, we're on YouTube, so you could go to YouTube and either type in Tom Christiano, my name, to find all my shows, or Politically Incorrect, and hopefully you'll find this show through that way as well. And this show will be on along with many other shows that we have on YouTube. But what do you think about the death with dignity laws, Evan? Any thoughts about that? You've been in the medical field for a while, and a lot of people have thoughts about that, significant thoughts.
Definitely, and we've seen these laws passed in some other states, like in Oregon, where they've had it in place for some years now, almost 15 years. And they've had a few hundred people that have used it and ended their life in that way. It's a very difficult issue for any individual to deal with. And I think that all of us have an obligation. I've done this, and I think all your viewers should, is to make sure you've got a living will that says this is what I want to have happen to me when I'm in this situation.
Very important.
It's a really difficult thing, and those decisions don't get made and they don't get talked about until it's really, really late at the end of the day. So, it was put on the ballot. It almost passed. I don't know if it'll be on there again, but it is the kind of thing that in a free society with medical care being the way it is, it ought to be available to people to have those kinds of choices as adults to be able to decide what they want to do, with appropriate safeguards to make sure that people aren't doing it because they're depressed when they could be treated for that, because life is an extraordinarily precious thing that must be protected.
Yes, I agree. But with the medical technology that we have now to keep people alive, like we have a unfortunate young 13-year-old girl right now being kept alive even though she's clinically dead, and the mother, that she doesn't want to let her go. And it's a very sad thing, but we have medical technology now that could keep a body alive for years and years and decades with no quality of life at all, and costing maybe $100,000 or more per year to the citizens of this country.
Right.
Because I'm sure that a lot of people can't afford this, and it comes down to the taxpayer. And so we have to be able to make choices, and I think a lot of people, like myself included, wouldn't want to live in a vegetative state for months on end, So hopefully death with dignity will pass. I'm glad to hear you talk logically about that, and rationally and compassionately about that. What do you think about this 3-cent per gallon hike on gasoline? It's currently at 21 cents a gallon, and indexing it to inflation. It's a big issue at the State House right now.
Yeah, it is. And you hear, look, the gas tax at 24 cents in Massachusetts is pretty much middle of the road around the country, actually a little bit lower than a lot of states. Connecticut's got a 46-cent per gallon. New York, 50 cents. So we're sort of middle of the road, and we haven't had an increase in some time. The political issue is interesting, because at the State House, the people talk about this indexing it to inflation as somehow taxation without representation or something. But the sales tax is a % of what you buy. So when inflation happens, you pay more. So is that also something that they would suggest? And so this is the problem. We end up in these very strange dead-end arguments that are very Alice in Wonderland. You're through the looking glass and you're saying, this doesn't make any sense. Now, you can be against the idea of increasing the gas tax. That's a perfectly honorable, appropriate position for someone to take. But we have a legislature that voted, and one side won. And what we have to do as Americans is be able to say, if our democracy is going to be able to function, we have to say, when the majority wins, we move forward. We move forward. And that's what we have to do. Unfortunately, we're in this cycle of, and you see it here in Massachusetts, you see it in Washington, D.C. right now. Someone passes a law, let's repeal it. And
Yes.
you know, that's the big picture on Obamacare is we got to repeal it. So let's stop all functions of government to make sure that stops.
Yes.
In Massachusetts, you see the same thing trying to get started. Let's repeal this gas tax. Let's make sure that we seize up the machinery of government over these issues that are great political issues for those party organizations, not great for the people.
Yes, yes. I agree with you 100%.
Thank you.
What about this $1 hike in the current $2.51 per pack cigarette tax? I mean, and you know who affects that mostly. It's lower income people generally who smokes now.
Yeah.
A lot of people just have given that up. So we're talking about $3.51 if this additional $1 hike passes. $3.51 tax on each pack of cigarettes. It's amazing.
It's a lot,
Yeah.
and you know, it's one of the challenges we have is that because we have a difficult time in our state figuring out what's the right way to make our tax system work, we rely on these taxes that are regressive in nature.
Yes, yes.
And
This is very regressive.
It's very
right?
regressive. Now, the challenge is, I mean, just being fair about it, is that about 10% of our healthcare expenditures are tied to smoking-related illnesses. It's an enormous cost on our society,
Yes,
smoking,
yeah.
and so. You know, the tax may or may not affect people's decision whether to smoke or not. I'd like to see us do much, much more, like so many of the large employers and small employers do around the country to help people stop smoking. It's a
Yes.
bad thing.
Yes.
And if we think about it purely in financial terms, it's very expensive to
yeah.
everybody. And in human terms, the suffering caused by smoking-related illnesses is tragic.
Yes,
So
yeah.
any of these programs that help people avoid the problem of smoking are for the good.
Yes, yes. Well, I agree to some extent, but I'm not sure about increasing the taxes on this because some lower income people are just so addicted to it they can't give it up, and to see them spend a greater portion of their income.
It's
I
the-
think
it's the
$2.51
unfairness of
a
it.
pack, I think, is plenty, and I wouldn't want to say $3.51 personally, but it just gets to be to a point that. What are you doing to these poor people? Do you
Right.
know?
Understood.
But Evan, before we leave, do you want to give the people at home some ideas about your website again and your campaign and how they can get in touch with you?
So please visit us at falchuk2014.org.
And how do you spell
That's
the
FALCHUK 2014.org. You can also go to evan2014.org if it's easier for you to remember Evan. 'cause
EVAN, right?
Right, yep.
2014.org.
And go to our Facebook page, Evan Falchuk MA. And what you'll see there, by the way, two things at both places. A lot of information about the positions that I have, openly talking about it, and especially on Facebook, a lot of dialogue that I get into with people that ask questions.
Yes.
And it's very different from what you see with most candidates. It's the kind of candidate I am, and it's the kind of governor I will be.
Yes. Well, Evan, I hope when we have the debates for the governorship that you're involved with those debates. Do you have to get 15% or something like that in primaries or something to be invited?
They always negotiate out how these things work, and I think it's extremely important for any of your viewers who say, boy, I'd love to hear that kind of dialogue in the debates, is to call your local press and make sure you say, hey, that independent Evan Falchuk, I like what he's got to say.
Yes.
Make sure he's up there debating with the rest of them.
Yes, maybe
I plan to be there, and I do look forward to
certainly hope
debating
you
these
are,
issues
because I think you've
with the candidates.
articulated your positions in a very clear, concise, compassionate manner. I think you have a lot to offer the people of Massachusetts, and I'm not making endorsement one way or the other. I'm just saying,
appreciate it.
I think you should have the ability to be on there on that stage with the other candidates, the Republican, the Democrat, and the independent candidate like yourself.
Thank you.
I think you have a lot to offer the people of Massachusetts, and I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us
Pleasure.
today, and best of luck with your campaign.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks.
Thank you
It was a
very
lot of
much.
fun. Thank you.
you.